As you can imagine, just 2 or 3 days before we went into lockdown, churches had already decided to close. We had kept ours open, knowing full well that we would probably only have 30 to 40 people from our church. So we took out a good 2/3 of the chairs and we spread the remaining few around. And we had worship, very much little island by ourselves. And as we thought, only about 30 people came. So a lot of people missed the sermon, and I've had requests to do it. So this is the sermon from roughly 3 weeks ago now. And if you'd like to read Psalm 23, that wonderful psalm, the Lord is my shepherd, and John 18, 1 to 11, which is Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane, I'll give you a moment to do that and then we'll carry on. So it's Psalm 23 and John 18, 1 to 11. Okay. For those of you that aren't familiar with biblical studies, which is 90% of us, there is a technical term called rescuing the text. Sometimes certain texts can be read in a negative way, and we are discovering as we reread these texts, perhaps with new insights, and we reflect on them, we see that there are alternative interpretations that are more positive in nature and more accurate in their understanding of the text. And when this is done, it can be said that the text has been rescued. For those of us in South Africa, we are well aware that the apartheid government used Bible texts to justify some very bad laws in this country. And scholars from churches and universities showed how these texts needed to be reread more accurately, and the support for apartheid fell away. So rescuing texts is important when we discover that we've not understood them clearly. Now, for me, Psalm 23 is a personally rescue text. Everybody knows Psalm 23. Even most people who don't read the Bible know about Psalm 23. But usually it's because it's read in the context of a memorial service. And that was how I was familiar with the text. And because of this, I'd never really reflected on it and kind of made use of it in my own life. But that changed at the beginning of this year when Dennis Schott passed away. Because it was Dennis's favorite psalm, I was asked to share some thoughts on it during his memorial service. And having to reflect on that text for that service gave me a completely new understanding of the text, and it was rescued for me. It is actually the set text for this particular week in March. And I found it rather ironic because of the situation that we're finding ourselves in today in South Africa and around the world. So I thought that I'd share my experience of this text, and hopefully in rescuing it from the context of the memorial service this morning, we will find that we too have been rescued from the fear that we face today and some of the concerns that we have, because I think we need that right now in our lives. So let's start by looking at Psalm 23. It's a psalm that was written by David, the son of Jesse, who began his life as a shepherd boy, the youngest of 8 boys in the family. And his life ended with him being king over the 12 unified tribes of Israel, having established them as some political and military force in the region. And in this psalm, we see both aspects of David's life reflected, that of the shepherd and that of being in a position of more wealth and a court kind of setup. David uses both of these images to convey the same sort of ideas, that of protection and provision. And these are the basis of his relationship for God, and he experienced both of these in his life. Now, within poetry, repetition is a common technique used to emphasize something. And I think that David is trying to stress here the depth to which God can be trusted throughout all the seasons of our life. So let's start with the shepherd imagery that is used. David, as you know, began life as a shepherd and was a good shepherd by all accounts that we can gain. He was well acquainted with the roles and the responsibilities of a shepherd, along with the tools of the trade and the skills that were needed to be successful in this line of work. A shepherd's job was to take care of the needs of the sheep and to see that they were both fed and watered and kept safe. On a daily basis, David would have had to have led the sheep out of the fold where they'd been kept safe overnight, and then taken down the hillsides around Bethlehem where they were grazing. Walking them down the sides of the hills and the valleys down to the streams and the rivers and the wells to drink was a familiar routine to him. And like every shepherd, David had both a staff and a sling. The staff was not only used to lean on, but also used to pull sheep and lambs to safety when they'd fallen down a hillside or were struggling to climb the sides of a valley. And of course, the staff, like that, could lend a serious clout if you were an animal that fancied lamb for lunch. The sling, however, was a much better weapon for defense. It allowed a skilled person to drop a predator as far away as 400 meters. And we get the impression that David really was skilled because we learn from the book of Samuel that David had defeated both the lion and a bear in defending his father's flock. And that struck me because just how committed do you have to be to your sheep to stand up against a lion and a bear? Particularly in those days. It's quite something. And in that we see that the relationship between the shepherd and his sheep was a special one. It was one where he would be prepared to lay down his life. And apparently the shepherds knew their sheep so well that when the flocks all mingled at the well together as different shepherds brought their animals to take water, each shepherd could identify his own sheep. And in addition to that, as he moved away from the well and called his sheep knew his voice so well that the animals would separate out, responding to his voice, and follow him back to the grazing. So shepherds love and care for their sheep, and the sheep's trust and follow their shepherd. And that relationship dynamic is quite special and something to behold. And David drew on this experience to describe his relationship with God, one where God was the shepherd that cared for him, the one who had provided nourishment for his soul, a place of safety and guidance in finding his way through life. And that's what changed for me about this psalm. This psalm is not about facing death. It is about living life with God. I think what had always ruined this psalm for me is that one verse that seemed to always catch my attention, and one particular word. Even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Now, I don't read Hebrew, so I'm going to have to trust scholars for this. But I believe that a fair number of them have said that the valley of shadow of death is actually more accurately translated as the valley of dark shadows. Now, you only get dark shadows in really deep valleys. Traveling through a deep valley is never easy. It can take a considerable length of time, and it can be quite intimidating and scary depending on what is hiding in the cliffs above. So this verse is drawing on the image of deep trouble and perhaps prolonged stress in a person's life. And David had quite a few of those situations of his own, because besides facing lions, bears, and rather large Philistines, David had survived Saul's prolonged campaign of hatred that involved several attempts on his life from the early days where Saul was personally throwing spears at him, to going after David with his army, and this resulted in David having to go into hiding for a few years. Later in life, when David became king, he experienced the very dark pain of losing his firstborn son as a young infant. And later on, his son Absalom killed his half-brother Amnon because Amnon had raped Absalom's sister Tamar. Big family problems with prolonged periods of pain and stress. And as a much older man, of course, David survived a coup led by Absalom and a trusted advisor who saw David fleeing from Jerusalem up the Kidron Valley, over the Mount of Olives, and across into the Judean desert. David then had to take back his throne from his son, who tragically ended up dying in a freak accident during the battle, even though David had given orders that his son was to be spared. So when it comes to dark valleys in life, David had a number to walk through. And yet he still writes this psalm and speaks of God's presence and his guidance. I will fear no evil because you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. See, David was aware of God literally pulling him out of trouble and setting him back on solid ground again. His experience was one of living life with God, trusting in his care, in his provision, and in God's ability to comfort, guide, and help in times of trouble. The second part of the psalm draws on the imagery of a banquet and repeats these ideas of provision and protection. Middle Eastern hospitality codes meant that a host needed to provide well for his guest. Not just food and rest and shelter, but also protection and provisions for the continued journey. If an enemy happened to arrive at your gate seeking to harm your guest, as the host, you are honor bound to protect your guest. Hence the verse 5 of Psalm 23, you prepare a table for me in the presence of my enemies. The picture is the enemies being close, but the host is protecting the person that is sitting at his table. David knew that he was safe in the hands of the Lord, despite going through these dangerous and difficult times in life. So again, the psalm is about living life. It's about walking with trust and confidence in our Lord, who loves us more than we can imagine. Does this mean that life will be easy and comfortable? Not at all. No, it doesn't. However, we can know that we're not alone in life, and we do not need to fear. Just over 1,000 years later, Jesus would walk a very similar route to his ancestor David through the Kidron Valley. After the Passover meal, Jesus and his disciples walked out the east side of Jerusalem, across the Kidron River and up the Mount of Olives. Here he would pray and seek comfort from the Lord, knowing full well what was about to happen in the next 24 hours. Luke's Gospel gives us an intimate picture of the struggle that Jesus went through in the Garden of Gethsemane as he knelt to pray whilst his disciples slept nearby. John's Gospel, however, goes straight to the act of betrayal by Judas Iscariot. What I want to notice in this reading is the two different responses to the threat of the soldiers arriving in the garden. So reading from John, we see these words. Then Jesus, knowing all that would happen to him, came forward and said to them, "Whom do you seek?" They answered him, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus said to them, "I am he." When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. A few lines later, then Simon Peter, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant and cut off his right ear. So Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword in its sheath. Shall I not drink this cup that the Father has given me?" So in these verses, we see two reactions. Simon Peter panics and lashes out, whereas Jesus stays calm, even though he knows exactly what lies in front of him. I believe that Jesus was able to go through this whole experience with a sense of calm and peace because he trusted in God's plan. He had his eyes fixed on the outcome of the next few days. Yes, he knew that the crucifixion was coming, but he also knew that his resurrection lay just on the other side of that. And then, beyond that, he saw heaven filled with those who would be reconciled to the Father through his sacrifice. Jesus returned to Jerusalem along exactly the same road that David did. But whereas David traveled down the Mount of Olives, along the Kidron Valley and back up the slopes into Jerusalem to reclaim his crown and the throne, Jesus returned to face a cross of thorns and a crown of thorns and a wooden cross. I wonder if this son of David thought about Psalm 23 as he entered Jerusalem this last time. I think he probably did. Ironically, by this time, Jesus was walking down the road that on the left side of the Kidron Valley, it had now become a large graveyard dating back to the time of his ancestors, King David. So perhaps we can read these words this time. Even though I walk through the valley of shadow of death, I will fear no evil. For you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies, and you anoint my head with oil, and my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Trust, confidence, and a sense of peace in the face of adversity. I think we could do with a little of that right now. We do need to be sensible when it comes to the coronavirus. This is a very serious situation. We need to be committed to assisting our families, our communities, and our countries to stay safe as far as each one is able to contribute to that. So we do need to practice social distancing, personal hygiene with a regular washing of hands, making sure that we don't pass anything on. If you have a cold of any sort, stay at home, even if it's not the virus, because you don't want to spread it and compromise somebody else's immune system and make them vulnerable. And of course, you don't want to pick the virus up yourself. Eat healthily and sleep plenty so that your immune system stays strong. One of the biggest enemies of our immune system is stress. Stress weakens our immune system and makes us vulnerable, particularly prolonged periods of stress. And the experts are saying that we are in for a long fight with this virus before things return to normal. So it is very important that we have a reasonable understanding of this virus and we don't allow ourselves to be completely stressed out and panicked and not buy into the hysteria. The reality is that only 14% of those who get the virus end up in hospital, and 4% of those end up in ICU and dying. Symptoms can range from a bad cold to horrible flu that can end in pneumonia, particularly if you have underlying issues such as diabetes, heart problems, and lung problems, or if you've been treated at the moment for chemotherapy. With all this panic and hysteria going around, it seems that most folks feel that even coming into contact with the virus is a death sentence, but it isn't. So don't freak out. Many people have coronavirus and get over it. So please, be compassionate and supportive of those who are sick during this time. Don't ostracize them, because 90% of what they're going to have is probably not corona. But they will be afraid and take all precautions that are necessary. But please, let's not hear of any more incidences of mobs going to burn down houses. Support small businesses when you can. I mean, small businesses right now are going to be the ones that are going to struggle the most. Be careful. Be sensible. So yes, the people in this community around the world are walking through a valley right now, a particularly deep and dark one. And we don't know when the end is in sight. But we can choose to respond in panic like Peter did, or we can choose to walk with a measure of peace, just like David and Jesus did, trusting in the great Good Shepherd that will guide us, comfort, and restore our souls. I'd like to finish with a few more verses. They were the words of Jesus that he spoke to his disciples as he walked up the Mount of Olives, just hours before he was taken captive by the Romans. He said these words to the disciples after speaking to them about a couple of issues. He ends by saying, "These things I have spoken to you while I am still with you. But the Helper, the Holy Spirit, whom the Father will send in my name, he will teach you all things and bring to your remembrance all that I have said to you. Peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid." Please take these words with you as you go into the week ahead. Our Good Shepherd is with us, walking by our side, protecting and providing for us. Amen.